Hey everybody, it's Eric. I'm going to go over how to get SharePoint list and site information out of a SharePoint list flow using PowerShell today. So what you want to do is start off with your tenant ID here. If you need help finding your tenant ID, and there's no admin around to give you a hand, you can easily go to make.powerautomate.com. The flows are typically stored in the default environment. You can get that value here in the URL. Just get rid of the default dash. That's a normal Microsoft naming thing. You can get the default environment or the environment ID right there. It's that GUID. So you want to copy that and paste it right here. You want to do add Power Apps account. So this depends on the Microsoft Power Apps Administration PowerShell library. If you don't have that, you can go get that online. Just search for, Power Platform SharePoint or Power Platform PowerShell, and you'll find it. Pass in the tenant ID. This is going to prompt you for credentials. Go ahead and authenticate yourself in. In this case, if you want to do all environments, you can do get admin Power App environment. I only have one environment for this demo, so I'm only going to set this to the one. Results here is just an empty array, which is where I'm going to populate the results for this demo in an online grid view. So first thing I want to do is go get all the flows, and again you can specify an individual flow here by passing in flow name and the GUID ID of the flow. This is not the display name, this is the internal ID of the flow. In this case I only have one flow, so I'm just going to grab it here. And then I'm going to iterate through each one of those. Notice I have to call it again here and pass in the flow name. The initial enumerator for getAdmin flow to see them all does not include the information that we're looking for. When I call an individual flow by designating a flow name and the flow name value, which is that GUID again, that's going to expose a property we need called referenced resources, which we're going to get to here in a second. I'm setting up some empty variables. Now, for each one of these internal properties referenced resources, it's going to have a service inside, and this has to do with whatever API calls are being made by the flow. If the service is SharePoint, now I know I'm talking to a SharePoint site, and the underlying list of that resource, which will be the ID GUID of the list ID, is not null. Now I know I'm talking directly to a SharePoint list, and I know this flow is generated from a SharePoint list, so I can proceed. This must be a SharePoint site. Here's later on I can say if it was SharePoint, do something, otherwise don't. That's what this was for. But the biggest thing I want to take out of this is the site URL is under resource.site of these referenced resources, and the list ID is resource list. We don't get the list name, we only get the list ID, but you can extract the name by making additional calls to Graph API or by just navigating to API web lists, get by ID, and then pass in the ID. Lots of ways to get this. We're going to frame the date and time here based on the variables from the flow, and then we're going to look at connection references. And this is going to pull back any connectors that are included in your flow. For the purposes of this demo, I'm adding a line for each connector. So you're going to see multiple results because I have 3 connectors in this flow, and that's intentional. You could decide to bundle them all in one column or report them out in a separate list. Totally up to you. But for the purposes of this demo, you're going to see 3 lines, 1 line for each connector with all the main flow information associated with it. This is obtained by using the getMember of note property type. This data is stored in a PowerShell property called note property, which is just think of it like a multi-line of text. For each one of those connections, I'm going to read the definition value or member of that connection as raw data, no property. Then I'm going to convert from string raw data and pull back a nice enumerable PowerShell object that I can then get these details I want from. So the connector ID is going to be in prop data P4, and the connector display name is going to be in prop data P4 if it's before a certain date range. If it's after this date range, 6823, it's going to be in prop data P5. There was apparently a schema change at that point. I happened to discover this offhand, so I documented it for myself. So I'm going to update the connector ID here and the connector display name here. Then all I have to do is just construct my custom object. Again, this is just for the purposes of this online grid view. I got the flow internal information, the environment information, owner ID. If you want more user properties, you can call Azure AD and pull down other AD properties for the user. Right now I'm just going to show you the ID. Created modified dates, the connector name, connector ID, the site URL, and the list ID. Let's take a look at this in action and see what kind of results we get here. I'm just going to start from here to speed things up. And I get my grid view with repeated information again because I got one line for each connector. But here's where you can see the underlying site, the URL that this is connecting to, and the list ID here, which corresponds to the underlying list, which in this case is the demo list on my SPFX demo site. And each of the connector names here, you can see it is Office 365, 365 users, and SharePoint Online. That is one way you can get connector and flow detailed information from a list flow out of Power Automate using PowerShell.